in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, another ship spotted a vessel drifting silently through the waves. There was no distress signal, no visible damage, no smoke, no movement on deck. When the rescue crew climbed aboard, they expected to find frightened sailors. Instead, they found something far stranger. The dining table was set. The coffee was still warm. Fresh bread had been sliced. A meal had been abandoned only moments before. Yet there wasn't a single person anywhere on the ship. No passengers, no crew, no bodies, no lifeboats. It looked as if dozens of people had simply vanished into thin air. More than half a century later, investigators still can't fully explain what happened aboard that mysterious vessel. This is a true story of one of the most baffling ghost ships ever discovered. On the morning of October 3rd, 1955, the cargo ship Juita departed from the harbor of Apia, Samoa, beginning what should have been a routine voyage across the South Pacific. The destination was Tokelau, a remote island group more than 250 miles away. The trip was expected to take less than 2 days. For Captain Thomas Henry Miller, it was another ordinary assignment. Miller wasn't an inexperienced sailor. He had spent decades at sea. He had served during World War II. He knew these waters better than most navigators alive. His crew trusted him. Local merchants trusted him. The island communities depended on ships like the Juita to survive. Unlike major ports connected by large commercial routes, these isolated islands relied almost entirely on vessels bringing food, medicine, fuel, and essential supplies. Every successful voyage meant families could continue their daily lives. Every delayed shipment created problems that rippled through entire communities. The Juita itself had an unusual history. Originally built in California before World War II, the vessel had been designed with an almost unbelievable safety feature. Its hull contained large sections filled with cork insulation and sealed air chambers. Even if flooded, engineers believed the ship could never completely sink. Many sailors even joked that the Juita was unsinkable. That reputation made what happened later even more disturbing. On board that October morning were 25 people. Captain Miller, 16 crew members, several passengers, doctors, government officials, island workers returning home. The cargo reflected everyday life in the Pacific. Medical supplies, construction materials, food, mail, fuel, household goods. Nothing unusual, nothing secret, nothing dangerous. Weather forecasts looked favorable. No major storms had been reported along the planned route. The sea wasn't expected to present serious challenges. As the ships slowly disappeared beyond the harbor, families waved goodbye from the shoreline. No one watching imagined they had just seen those people for the last time, because after that morning, the Juita simply vanished. When the ship failed to arrive on schedule, people weren't immediately alarmed. Mechanical problems weren't uncommon. Radio failures happened. Sometimes vessels simply arrived a day or two late. The Pacific Ocean was enormous. Delays were part of life. But as another day passed, then another, concern slowly turned into fear. Radio stations across the region repeatedly called the Juita. No answer. Nearby ships were asked to watch for the missing vessel. Nothing. Aircraft began searching from above. They scanned thousands of square miles of open ocean. Still nothing. It was as though an entire ship had disappeared without leaving behind a single trace. As the days passed, hope began to fade. The Pacific Ocean is unimaginably vast. Finding a single ship drifting somewhere across thousands of square miles is like trying to find a single leaf floating on an endless lake. Still, authorities refused to give up. The disappearance of the Juita quickly became one of the largest maritime search operations ever conducted in that part of the Pacific. Aircraft from New Zealand flew systematic search patterns for hours every day. Merchant ships altered their routes. Military vessels joined the effort. Radio stations broadcast constant requests for information. Every captain sailing nearby kept binoculars pointed toward the horizon. Nothing. Day after day. Nothing. The sea seemed determined to keep it secret. Fuel reserves began running low for the search aircraft. Crews grew exhausted. Yet officials kept expanding the search area. Perhaps strong currents had pushed the Juita farther than expected. Perhaps the ship had changed course after suffering engine trouble. Perhaps the captain had attempted an emergency landing on an isolated reef. Every possibility was considered. Families gathered near harbor offices every morning hoping for news. Many refused to believe the worst. Captain Miller had survived dangerous wartime missions. His crew knew these waters. The Juita itself had been built to stay afloat even after serious flooding. If any ship could survive an accident, surely it was this one. But weeks passed, then nearly a month. Eventually, many people quietly accepted what seemed inevitable. The ocean had claimed another ship, without wreckage, without survivors, without answers. Then, on November 10th, more than 5 weeks after the Juita disappeared, the crew of another vessel noticed something strange on the horizon. A lonely ship drifted slowly across the open sea. No distress flags, no smoke, no movement. At first, they assumed the crew must be asleep or below deck. As they approached, silence. The ship answered no radio calls. No one appeared at the rails. No footsteps echoed across the deck. Only the sound of waves striking the hull. The rescuers carefully climbed aboard. What they found immediately made experienced sailors uneasy. The Juita was still floating, but something about the scene felt deeply wrong. It wasn't simply abandoned. It looked interrupted, as though life had stopped in the middle of an ordinary day. The engines were no longer operating. Several compartments contained seawater. Loose equipment lay scattered across parts of the deck, but there were no signs of a violent explosion, no evidence of fire, no indication that pirates had attacked. Inside the galley, meals had been prepared. Cooking utensils remained where they had been left. Some reports from the first responders described food that appeared to have been recently served, helping fuel one of the greatest legends surrounding the case. Whether every detail of those early accounts was perfectly accurate or not, everyone agreed on one disturbing fact. The crew had disappeared so suddenly that much of their daily routine had simply been left unfinished, and the deeper investigators searched the vessel, the stranger the mystery became. The first investigators moved cautiously through the corridors of the Juita. Every room seemed to raise more questions than answers. Cabins were open. Personal belongings remained inside. Clothes still hung from hooks. Books rested on bunks. Suitcases had not been packed. It didn't look as though anyone had prepared to leave the ship. Instead, it looked as if everyone had expected to return within minutes. The bridge revealed another disturbing clue. Several navigation instruments were still in place. Maps remained spread across the chart table. Pencils, rulers, and handwritten notes had been left exactly where officers had been working. There was no indication of panic inside the command area. Investigators searched every compartment. Storage rooms, engine spaces, crew quarters. The medical supplies were still aboard. The cargo had not been stolen. Valuable equipment remained untouched. If pirates had boarded the vessel, why leave everything behind? Then came an even stranger discovery. One of the ship's lifeboats was missing, not destroyed, simply gone. At first, this seemed to offer a simple explanation. Perhaps Captain Miller had ordered everyone into the lifeboat after believing the ship was sinking. But almost immediately, that theory began falling apart. The Juita had not sunk. Even after drifting for weeks across the Pacific, she was still floating, badly damaged, but still afloat. Marine engineers later explained that because of her unique construction, complete sinking would have been extremely difficult. The ship had lost power. Water had entered parts of the hull, but she continued drifting. If the captain believed the vessel would stay afloat, why abandon it? Investigators then noticed something else. The radio room wasn't completely normal. The main radio equipment had problems. Some components were damaged. One emergency transmitter was reportedly missing. Without reliable communication, the crew may have believed no rescue would ever find them. But even that explanation raised another question. Captain Miller had decades of experience. Experienced captains know that abandoning a floating ship is almost always considered the very last option, especially in the open Pacific. The vessel itself offers food, shelter, freshwater storage, a large target that aircraft can easily spot. A small lifeboat provides almost none of those advantages. Leaving a floating ship can actually reduce the chances of survival. So, what convinced an experienced captain to make such an extraordinary decision? Was the flooding worse than investigators later believed? Did the crew think the vessel would sink within minutes? Or had something happened that no longer made staying aboard possible? Then investigators found another clue that complicated the mystery even further. Several official documents were gone. The ship's logbook had disappeared. Certain navigation records were missing. Some portable communication equipment was no longer on board. These weren't random objects. They were exactly the kinds of items a captain would take during an organized evacuation. That suggested the departure hadn't been chaotic. It may have been deliberate, disciplined, even orderly. If that's true, then Captain Miller likely believed he was making the safest decision available, a decision that, somehow, no one survived. Once the Juita had been towed back to port, investigators began piecing together every clue they could find. They interviewed shipbuilders, marine engineers, Navy officers, veteran captains. Everyone hoped the evidence would point toward one clear answer. Instead, every theory explained part of the mystery. None explained all of it. The first and most accepted explanation involved mechanical failure. Investigators discovered that one of the cooling pipes connected to the engines had likely failed during the voyage. Without proper cooling, the engines eventually stopped. The ship lost power. Without electricity, radio communication became unreliable. The vessel began drifting. At the same time, seawater slowly entered through damaged piping and flooded parts of the engine room. Imagine standing aboard a ship in the middle of the Pacific. The engines are silent. Water is rising below deck. The radio barely works. The nearest land is hundreds of miles away. Under those circumstances, even experienced sailors might begin believing the vessel was doomed. Some investigators believe Captain Miller feared the flooding was much worse than it actually was. Perhaps he concluded that abandoning ship offered the best chance of survival. But there was one enormous problem. The Juita didn't sink. Not that day. Not the next day. She floated alone for more than 5 weeks. That makes many historians wonder whether the captain misjudged the situation, or whether he was responding to something investigators never discovered. Another theory focused on the missing lifeboat. If everyone entered that small boat together, they would have faced impossible odds. The Pacific Ocean can appear calm one moment and become deadly the next. Strong currents, towering waves, sudden storms. A lifeboat overloaded with more than 20 people would have been incredibly vulnerable. It may have overturned. It may have drifted far away from the Juita. If that happened, the ocean could easily erase every trace. No wreckage, no survivors, no evidence. Then came one of the more controversial theories. Some writers suggested pirates. Others proposed smugglers. A few even imagined secret military operations. These ideas captured public imagination for decades, but investigators found almost nothing supporting them. The cargo remained aboard. Valuable equipment wasn't stolen. There were no bullet holes, no blood, no signs of violence. Nothing suggests an attack. As a result, most professional historians consider those theories highly unlikely. Yet one mystery remained impossible to ignore. Why would an experienced captain abandon a ship specifically designed to stay afloat? That single question continues to divide maritime experts today, because every logical explanation eventually runs into the same obstacle. Captain Thomas Miller had spent a lifetime making decisions at sea. If he truly ordered everyone into that lifeboat, he must have believed staying aboard was even more dangerous. Whatever convinced him disappeared with him forever. As investigators continued examining the Juita, one frustrating reality became impossible to escape. The ship itself could still answer questions, but the people who had lived through those final hours were gone. Without survivors, every conclusion depended on physical evidence, and that evidence refused to tell a complete story. Divers searched the surrounding waters. Nothing. Aircraft flew additional reconnaissance missions. Nothing. Nearby islands were questioned. No fishermen reported seeing the missing lifeboat. No coastal village had rescued exhausted sailors. No floating debris connected to the crew was ever recovered. It was as though the ocean had swallowed 25 people without leaving behind a single trace. Investigators then turned their attention to the weather. Could a sudden storm have forced an evacuation? Historical weather records showed changing conditions in parts of the South Pacific during those days. Strong swells were certainly possible, but no major storm powerful enough to explain the disappearance had been confirmed directly along the Juita's route. That didn't completely rule out dangerous seas. The Pacific can become unpredictable within hours. Still, nothing explained why the crew abandoned a vessel that remained afloat for more than a month afterward. Marine engineers inspected every damaged section of the ship. They found flooding, mechanical failures, corroded piping, electrical problems, but none appeared catastrophic enough to guarantee immediate sinking. One engineer summarized the investigation with remarkable honesty. The ship had problems, but not enough to explain everything. That sentence captured the entire mystery. Every discovery answered one question and created another. Insurance companies conducted their own inquiries. Maritime authorities reviewed every report. Independent experts revisited the evidence years later. Many reached similar conclusions. Captain Miller probably believed the Juita was moments away from being lost. If that assumption was wrong, it became one of the most tragic decisions ever made at sea. Some researchers have suggested that the ship may have developed a severe list during flooding. From the captain's perspective, the angle of the deck, combined with engine failure and rising water, could have created the terrifying impression that capsizing was imminent. If darkness was approaching, if radio communication had failed, if panic began spreading among passengers, the decision to abandon ship might have seemed reasonable. But because no one survived, no one can tell us exactly what Captain Miller saw, or what convinced 24 other people to climb into a lifeboat and leave behind the one thing still capable of keeping them alive. In the end, the investigation quietly closed, not because every question had been answered, but because there was simply nothing left to investigate. The official files remained open to interpretation, and the Juita officially entered history as one of the greatest unsolved maritime mysteries ever recorded. Nearly 70 years have passed since the Juita disappeared into the vastness of the South Pacific. Ships have become safer. Navigation has become more precise. Satellites now watch oceans that once seemed endless. Modern emergency beacons can reveal a vessel's location within minutes. Yet despite all these advances, the mystery of the Juita remains unsolved. Today, maritime historians generally agree on one important point. The disappearance was almost certainly not supernatural. There is no credible evidence of ghosts, sea monsters, alien encounters, or mysterious forces. The real tragedy was almost certainly human. A series of unfortunate mechanical failures, difficult decisions, limited information, and one terrible judgment made under extreme pressure. Ironically, that explanation may be even more unsettling because it reminds us how quickly ordinary circumstances can become extraordinary. One damaged pipe, one failed radio, one incorrect assumption. Together, they may have changed the fate of 25 people forever. Many experts now believe Captain Miller genuinely thought he was saving everyone on board. Faced with flooding, powerless engines, failing communications, and an increasingly unstable vessel, he likely believed staying aboard guaranteed death. History suggests otherwise. The Juita survived. The people did not. That cruel irony continues to haunt every discussion of the case. The ship itself became a silent witness. It drifted alone across the Pacific for more than a month, waiting for someone to find it. When rescuers finally stepped aboard, the evidence had already been scattered by wind, salt, waves, and time. Every hour erased another clue. Every passing day made the truth harder to recover. By the time investigators examined the vessel, the most important evidence had already disappeared forever. Perhaps that's why the Juita continues to fascinate generations, not because of what we know, but because of everything we'll probably never know. There is no final confession, no recovered diary, no survivor rescued decades later. Only questions. Questions carried by the same ocean that swallowed an entire crew without leaving behind a single answer. Sometimes history ends with certainty. A battle is won, a city is discovered, a mystery is solved, but sometimes history simply stops, leaving behind an empty ship, a missing crew, and silence. Although historians generally agree that mechanical failure triggered the crisis aboard the Druida, several details continue to puzzle experts even today. These aren't supernatural mysteries. They're practical questions. Questions that have never received satisfying answers. The first involves the ship's condition when it was found. Despite weeks drifting through the Pacific, the Druida remained remarkably buoyant. Yes, water had entered parts of the hull. Yes, the engines had failed. But marine engineers later concluded the vessel still possessed enough flotation to remain above water for a very long time. Could Captain Miller have known that? Or did the flooding simply appear much worse from inside the ship than it actually was? Then there's the missing lifeboat. Not a single confirmed fragment was ever recovered. No oars, no life jackets, no personal belongings floating nearby. Nothing. The Pacific is vast, but oceans usually return something. A piece of wood, a fuel container, a section of canvas. In the Druida case, the sea returned almost nothing. Another unanswered question concerns a radio. Investigators determined that communication equipment had suffered serious problems. However, some specialists later argued that at least one emergency transmission might still have been possible under the right conditions. Did the crew attempt to call for help? Were their signals simply too weak? Or did no one hear them? We'll probably never know. The ship's logbook presents another mystery. It disappeared completely. Every captain depends on that log. It records positions, weather, mechanical issues, important decisions. If Captain Miller evacuated the ship, taking the logbook made perfect sense. It was standard procedure. But because it vanished along with the crew, the final hours of the voyage vanished too. There was also the question of timing. Several investigators believe the evacuation itself may have gone according to plan. There were no obvious signs of panic, no smashed doors, no desperate attempts to escape. Cabins remained surprisingly orderly. The bridge looked abandoned, not destroyed. That suggested discipline, organization, professional leadership. Exactly what one would expect from an experienced captain. Yet disciplined evacuations don't usually end with every single person disappearing forever. One final detail still fascinates maritime historians. The Druida had earned a reputation throughout the Pacific as a ship that simply refused to sink. Many local sailors knew that. Some had even joked that abandoning her would be pointless because she'd probably outlive everyone else. History proved those jokes strangely accurate. The ship survived. The people did not. That single contradiction has kept this case alive for generations, because every clue points toward an understandable decision, while the outcome remains almost impossible to understand. The Druida is often described as one of history's greatest ghost ships. But what exactly is a ghost ship? Contrary to popular imagination, the term doesn't refer to supernatural vessels sailing through the fog. In maritime history, a ghost ship is simply a vessel found abandoned without a clear explanation for the disappearance of those aboard. Over the centuries, dozens of such ships have been discovered. Some drifted for days, others for months. A few crossed entire oceans with no one left to guide them. Most eventually received logical explanations. Storms, disease, mutiny, fire, collisions, yet a small handful continue to resist certainty. The Druida belongs to that rare group. Unlike many ghost ship stories that became exaggerated through legends, the Druida's mystery is remarkable precisely because the documented facts are already extraordinary. There was no need to invent monsters, no need for haunted oceans. Reality had already created a mystery powerful enough. Maritime academies still discuss the case today, not because they expect to solve it, but because it illustrates how emergencies unfold at sea. Experienced captains study situations where incomplete information forces impossible decisions. The Druida has become one of those lessons. Students learn how small mechanical failures can escalate, how communication problems increase uncertainty, how stress affects judgment. Most importantly, they learn one principle repeated by sailors for generations. Never abandon a ship unless there is absolutely no alternative. Because history has shown that a damaged ship often survives longer than those who leave it. Ironically, the Droida itself became living proof of that lesson. Long after her crew vanished, she continued floating peacefully across the Pacific. The vessel that everyone believed was about to sink outlived every person aboard. In later years, the Droida changed owners several times. Attempts were made to repair her, to return her to service. But the mystery surrounding her never disappeared. Eventually, age and deterioration caught up with the old cargo ship. She was retired, then slowly dismantled. Today, very little remains of the vessel itself. The steel has vanished. The engines are gone. The cabins no longer exist. Yet the questions she carried survived far longer than the ship ever could. Perhaps that's why historians still return to her story. Not because they expect new evidence to appear, but because the Droida reminds us that history isn't always neatly explained. Sometimes, the greatest mysteries aren't hidden beneath the ocean. They're hidden inside ordinary decisions made by ordinary people during the worst day of their lives. If the Droida disappeared today, the story would almost certainly unfold very differently. Modern ships carry technology that Captain Miller could never have imagined. GPS continuously reports a vessel's position. Emergency beacons automatically transmit distress signals when activated. Satellite phones allow communication almost anywhere on Earth. Weather forecasts are updated constantly. Rescue coordination centers can track missing vessels within minutes. At first glance, it seems impossible that 25 people could simply disappear without a trace in the 21st century. But maritime experts are careful not to become overconfident. The ocean still commands enormous respect. Even with today's technology, ships continue to vanish. Aircraft still disappear over open water. Fishing boats occasionally lose contact without warning. Nature remains far stronger than any machine built by human hands. Technology reduces risk. It does not eliminate it. One important lesson from the Droida concerns human psychology. When emergencies unfold, people rarely possess complete information. Captains don't see the future. They make decisions based on what they believe is happening at that exact moment. Imagine standing on the bridge of a powerless ship. Water is entering below. The engines have stopped. The radio has failed. Passengers are becoming frightened. Darkness is approaching. Every minute feels more dangerous than the last. In that situation, waiting calmly for rescue is much easier to recommend from the comfort of a courtroom than from the deck of a drifting ship. This is why investigators have gradually become less interested in assigning blame. Instead, they try to understand the pressures facing Captain Miller. History often judges decisions by their outcomes, but the people making those decisions never know the outcome in advance. Captain Miller didn't know the Droida would remain afloat for another 5 weeks. If he had known, he almost certainly would have stayed aboard. That tragic gap between what people know and what later proves to be true has shaped countless disasters throughout history. The Droida is remembered because someone made an obviously foolish decision. She's remembered because experienced professionals may have made the best decision they could using incomplete information. That possibility makes the story far more human and far more heartbreaking because it reminds us that history's greatest tragedies are not always caused by recklessness. Sometimes they're caused by good people trying to make the right choice without realizing that history is about to prove them wrong. History has a way of preserving some mysteries forever, not because the evidence was destroyed, not because people stopped searching, but because time quietly erases the final pieces of the puzzle. The Droida became one of those mysteries. For decades, journalists returned to the story. Historians reopened old reports. Marine engineers re-examined photographs. Researchers compared witness statements. Each generation hoped to discover the one overlooked clue that would finally explain everything. No one found it. The official evidence still points toward the same likely sequence: a mechanical failure, flooding inside the engine room, loss of power, limited communication, a captain forced to make an impossible decision. Yet the most important moments, the conversations, the fears, the final vote to abandon ship, the launch of the missing lifeboat, those moments disappeared with the 25 people who experienced them. The Pacific Ocean kept their secret, perhaps forever. There is something strangely powerful about stories like this, not because they leave us frightened, but because they remind us how fragile certainty really is. When we look back at history, we often imagine that every event followed a clear path, that someone always knew what to do, that disasters happened because of obvious mistakes. The Droida teaches the opposite. Sometimes intelligent people make reasonable decisions, and history still ends in tragedy. Sometimes experience isn't enough. Sometimes preparation isn't enough. Sometimes survival depends on a single piece of information that no one possesses. That is why the Droida continues to fascinate nearly 70 years later. Not because it is a ghost story, but because it is a profoundly human story. A story about responsibility, uncertainty, leadership, hope, and the impossible weight carried by those forced to choose between two dangerous options. Today, the ship itself is gone. Its steel has rusted away. Its decks have disappeared. Its engines have long since fallen silent. But its story continues drifting across generations, much like the vessel itself once drifted across the endless Pacific, still searching, still unanswered, still reminding us that the greatest mysteries in history are not always hidden inside ancient ruins or forgotten tombs. Sometimes they are found on an ordinary cargo ship, floating quietly across an empty ocean, waiting for someone to ask one final question. What really happened here? And perhaps the Pacific Ocean is the only witness that will ever know. If you enjoyed uncovering forgotten true stories like this one, consider subscribing to the channel. Every week, we explore remarkable events that once made headlines shape history and were slowly forgotten with time. Because sometimes, the most extraordinary stories are the ones history almost left behind.